Always a pleasure chatting with you. And I'm so excited to dive into hormones and thyroid information. So if you can introduce yourself to the people listening and watching and just share how you use a high fat, meat-based approach in your practice.
Okay, well, I'm a naturopath and osteopath, and I have a practice in southern Italy, but I do practice a lot online now. I recently had to close, I had to close my studio through the 2 lockdowns we had in Italy. And yes, I was actually recommending a ketogenic diet previously, and then I went into menopause, and I saw so many benefits and I went carnivore, and I saw so many benefits for myself, and so that inspired me to do a lot of research. And then I wrote my book, Good Fat is Good for Women in Menopause. And it just became an integral part of my protocol, the carnivore diet.
Okay.
And the high fat approach primarily, because women who come to me have been avoiding fat for decades. They have been dieting for decades since they were adolescents. And for a period of time, a high fat approach definitely reduces inflammation for them and gives them back the fat in order to make those steroid hormones.
Let's just take it back a little bit and just talk about the basics of thyroid hormones. I know that the hypothalamus produces TRH, which is a hormone that then signals the pituitary and then the pituitary basically produces TSH to release to the thyroid that then produces T4 and then down the path to T3. But if you can just talk about the different, I guess, thyroid hormones and maybe even some of the antibodies, just some basics so we can understand and have the lay of the land so that we can then start talking about thyroid hormones.
Yeah. So the thyroid actually makes several hormones. It makes T4, about 80% T4, 16% T3, 4% T2 and T1. And T2 is becoming very interesting because it's very much involved in metabolism and really part of the functioning heart, So it stimulates the heart muscle.
Okay.
And then the thyroid also makes calcitonin, which regulates calcium in our body. So it's not just the one hormone that it makes. And I believe that T3 that the thyroid makes is very important also for the downstream conversion. So then there's the thyroglobulin, which is made in follicular cells of the thyroid, and that is part of the T4 to T3 synthesis. And then thyroid peroxidase is what traps the iodine. It's an enzyme. The thyroglobulin is a protein, and thyroid peroxidase is an enzyme, and that's involved. So first is thyroglobulin, then it moves to thyroid peroxidase, the enzyme, and that the finished product is, after it works with the iodine, is the thyroid hormone. So the problem with the antibodies is those two antibodies, antithyroglobulin and antithyroid peroxidase, attack because they always attack protein-derived products, and they denature those substances.
So if I were to go to my doctor, obviously the kind of conventional care, they only really measure TSH. But if I were to just get a basic panel, what markers would you say are a must to get?
Well, I would definitely say, so the TSH is really important. That's the problem today, is the TSH. And I will talk about that in a minute, because the TSH, a lot of receptors are not, the body is not receptive to the TSH. So there may be a need, so it doesn't TSH doesn't respond when there's not enough hormone, for instance. But definitely TSH, free T3, free T4, because that's the function. The two antibodies, unfortunately, they often only ask for anti-TGO. In Europe now, all the labs say, studies show you should also ask for anti-TBO, and they usually do in Europe now. The other thing that I would look for, though, is not only those, because you can actually have a hypofunctioning thyroid and your blood numbers are okay. So that's why what we were talking about before, symptoms are so important. There's so many nutrients that are not absorbed, as you very well know with all your experience in gut function. I look at vitamin D, I look at B12, I look at iron. So you can kind of see if the thyroid's not working, there are these other things that won't work either. So that may be something that I would investigate further.
Yeah. And I know that a lot of the T4 is converted in the liver, and then there are some T3 in the peripheral tissue, and then some of the I guess the conjugated versions of T4 in the gut then get converted to T3. So there's areas that we don't necessarily measure in the blood for T3, but I know that there are some people, including myself, that a low carb diet all of a sudden lowers the T3. Can you talk a little bit about if you see that as a normal state for a carnivore ketogenic diet? The TSH is normal, T4 is normal. All the other markers that we mentioned are relatively normal, but the T3 is now below the normal range.
Okay, well, first, we're not really sure that how much is converted in the liver and the kidneys. So the deiodinase is D1, D2, D3. D1 is in the liver and the kidneys, and they go from 81%, as high as 81%, or as low as 15% as converted. So they don't really know. But these, this is also new. They're still looking at these conversion pathways. And the other thing is that, well, a recent review said that they don't think that the primary conversion of T4 to T3 is necessarily D1 activated. So that's the iodinase, that's the selenocysteine enzyme that's in those primarily in the liver and the kidneys.
Gotcha.
That's doing that conversion. A lot of conversion is done by D2, which is in skeletal muscle, in the heart, and in the brain. So the interesting thing that the conversion is done by adrenergic stimulation. So when there's stress, or when there's your sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, D2 will convert a bunch of T4 into T3 because you need to respond to that stimulus. The heart does. And then again, like I mentioned, T2, that's where the T3 to T2 is converted by the D2 because the heart rhythm is regulated by D2. So there's still a lot we don't know as far as that is. So peripheral tissue may be more important in converting than we actually know.
I mean, if I am eating less carbohydrates in general, I have a less cortisol need, assuming that I'm also managing the life stressors, right? So
yeah,
if I need less conversion because I have less stressors, it's just interesting to me that there's a whole camp of people that believe if your T3 is too low, or that a low carb diet restricts the thyroid metabolism too much, and so therefore we should eat more carbs. I find it interesting because yes, my T3 is technically low, and I don't even know if it's low anymore. That was 2 years ago. But in that interim, I also nursed my son for 5 years. And I know you mentioned that it's normal, eons ago, where women were breastfeeding for longer, so they had less periods. And that was exactly me. So the first 2 to 3 years of nursing my son, I didn't have my period. And then it came later. And I was even able to add.
You didn't have your period. You shouldn't, because you're nursing. I mean, that's
right. Yeah. And so at the tail end, when he was nursing less and stuff, that's when I got it back. And then it was consistent. I mean, I have the energy to do all of this stuff, and I was still nursing him. So even though my T3 was technically low compared to the standard conventional markers, I mean, I feel fine. And not everyone feels fine with like a 1.7, 1.8 marker, but would you consider that if we just look at symptoms, then maybe I'm okay?
definitely. So I mean, I got to tell you, in a lot of cases, I won't even look at the bloods because the symptoms are predominant.
Okay.
And that's how they did it before. We can't only look at numbers. The TSH is produced several times during the day. You'll convert, as we said before, convert hormone as needed. So primarily when you were nursing, you were using a ton of nutrition. So you may actually have been undernourished, you could say, and that will lower T3. There's nothing to do with carbs, but being undernourished, you yourself, because so much is going out, it's not a bad thing. It's just that you were feeding your child, and there may not have been enough energy for your thyroid to upregulate and convert in that case. If you didn't have symptoms,
right,
that's hugely important. The thing, though, is that symptoms vacillate. So not in your case, but you can go from low to hyperfunctioning, especially in Hashimoto's.
right.
That's what we see a lot. But the carbs, that whole thing, I mean, I did a post about that too. There's absolutely no truth to that. There's not a single, I read all those studies, most of them produced in the 80s. There's a single one that shows on a glucose diet with rats, glucose diet only, rat chow, T3 went down. All the studies in humans show only if it's a hypocaloric diet. And there's even one that they did fat or carbs, and it didn't go down. They raised a little bit of carbs, it didn't improve until they raised the caloric count. So it had nothing to do with the carbs. It had nothing to do with the macronutrient. It had to do with they were starving. So that goes to D3, reverse T3. I didn't talk about in the markers, which you were mentioning before. Reverse T3 is backpedaling T3. So if your body doesn't have enough food, or there's a ton of inflammation, you are in a stress state, your body is not going to make T3. You're not going to convert T3 because T3 is a growth hormone. It's a regenerating hormone. It's an energy hormone. You can't metabolize energy if you don't have it.
Mentioning about my breastfeeding, that makes a lot of sense why my T3 might have been low at that time. And my son has stopped nursing for over a month and I still have a little bit of milk. So it's wild that the human body works that way. So maybe when I know for sure I'm not making any more milk, I could test my T3. And then in terms of what you're just mentioning, it's really interesting because a lot of people in the standard American diet, the conventional diets, their T3 is actually higher because maybe there's more of a demand for it, but it's not getting absorbed. And so it's usually like excess T3 causes T3 resistance. And then maybe if we're just naturally needing less of it, we are just more T3 sensitive, or again, it's in the peripheral tissues, or some of it's in the gut. But I mean, we naturally, our bodies produce our T3, which from my understanding, it's to pick up any excess T3 that then you can remove out of your body. So it's just...
Yeah, it does that. I have to tell you though, all of my patients, most of my patients came to me before they were carnivore. They all had low T3.
Okay.
So there is a case to be made for using less, the whole Finney argument, you know, you need less T3, so you're making less. But there's still a lot of people who have symptoms and who are hypothyroid, and they feel better when you treat the hypothyroidism. So that to me, immediately a carnivore diet is the best thing because it gives you the nutrients the thyroid needs. You say, you know, like you say, tyrosine. My big thing is iodine. Carnivore diet, you get the zinc, the proteins, everything you need is in the meat, more than it is in the vegetables and the fruit. So you have the raw materials. If you add the iodine, you have the raw materials. However, many people are taking beta blockers. Many people are taking benzodiazepines. Many people are taking all kinds of drugs and stimulants. Remember, stimulants will lower thyroid function because that adrenal stimulation is constantly ongoing. Thyroid hormone will be converting constantly in response.
Okay.
Like you run out of adrenal, function, you're going to run out of thyroid function as well. Maybe it's years of accumulation of excess stimulation and all these drugs put into it. A lot of patients who come to me are on medication. Those interfere with thyroid conversion, thyroid absorption.
Yeah, I didn't realize that beta blockers, because I have
block thyroid receptors.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I do have clients that are on beta blockers, but they also are hypothyroid. So that's very interesting.
And that blocker brain thyroid function.
Okay, good to know.